Her daughter-in-law spit on her hand right before Thanksgiving dinner. Irene Marshall, retired USPS worker and widow, didn't flinch. Her son Kyle chuckled, then asked for more gravy. By Monday, both their names would vanish from her trust, her deed, and every file they once assumed bore their inheritance. She'd raised him with sacrifice. Now she was safeguarding herself with silence and signatures. And when they finally came to collect, they found the mailbox full, but the assets long gone. We're about to begin, but if you'd like, share where you're joining from. It reminds me this story doesn't echo into silence. It lands somewhere real. Drop it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. The mashed potatoes hadn't even been passed when it happened. Irene Marshall stood behind Brittany's chair, arms gently outstretched, the kind of half-hug you give in a room full of people, where it's more about gesture than grip. The sweet potato casserole was still steaming beside the turkey. Irene had made it herself that morning like she always did. Her apron was folded neatly on the sideboard. Her lipstick, brick rose, same as every Thanksgiving, was barely smudged. And then Brittany turned, looked her directly in the eye, and spit on Irene's open hand. "Don't touch me." It wasn't loud, but it was clear, sharp, precise, like she'd been rehearsing. The room fell flat. Knives hovered mid-air. A child at the far end of the table dropped a green bean. Kyle let out a laugh. Not a roar, not a gasp, just a choked, awkward chuckle. "She's just messing," he mumbled, shaking his head, reaching for the rolls like nothing had happened. Nobody else spoke. Nobody else moved. Irene blinked once. That was all. Then she withdrew her hand, turned toward the hallway, and walked slowly but without stumble to the guest bathroom. The kind that still had the hand towels her sister had cross-stitched years ago, the kind that smelled faintly of lavender and pine sol. She closed the door gently behind her. No slam, no scene. Turned the faucet on. The water ran hot immediately. She adjusted it anyway. Then lathered soap into her palms, up past her wrist, scrubbing into the lines, the bends, beneath the thin gold band still circling her left hand. She washed for 5 minutes, not because the spit hadn't rinsed, but because the shame hadn't. She stared at her hands beneath the water like they didn't belong to her anymore. Hands that had sorted mail through blizzards, pulled splinters from Kyle's fingers, buttoned her husband's shirt collar in his casket. Hands that had cooked this meal, every single damn dish on that table. When she dried them, she used a paper towel. Not the embroidered ones, not today. She looked in the mirror, tucked one stray curl behind her ear, and pressed a fingertip beneath each eye. No tears, just the throb of withheld dignity, just beneath the surface of her cheekbones. Back in the dining room, conversation had restarted, shallow and meandering. Brittany was scrolling on her phone. Kyle was laughing at something on the football game muted in the background. A cousin asked about the cranberry relish. Nobody mentioned what had happened. Irene returned to her seat at the far end of the table. Her plate was full. Someone had served it for her. She picked up her fork, ate in silence, chewed the stuffing slowly, cut her turkey with neat, even strokes. She didn't reach for salt. She didn't comment on the rolls. She didn't look at Brittany again. No one looked at her. The only sound was the clink of forks and the hollow echo of small talk trying too hard. But inside her, something had calcified. She could feel it forming, quiet and cool, like a pane of glass setting across the surface of still water. She wouldn't forget this. Not the wet sting on her skin, not the silence of the room, not the sound of her son's laugh. Not one of them had stood up for her, not even the man she had given everything to. As dessert was served, pie slices too sweet to cover anything bitter, Irene stood again. "I'm full," she said. Nobody stopped her. She returned to the kitchen, unwrapped the foil from a second pie no one knew she'd made, and slid it quietly into the back of the fridge. It was lemon meringue, her favorite, and this time it would stay untouched, just like the respect she had come in with. The next morning, Irene set the kettle on before the sun had risen. No radio, no slippers, just the click of her cane across the kitchen tile and the slow breath of someone who'd decided something important overnight. She took her tea plain, no sugar, no cream, and sat at the dining table where the centerpiece of silk leaves still sat untouched. The silence wasn't new, but today, it felt earned. The manila folder was already waiting in the drawer. She pulled it out gently, careful not to crease the corners. Inside, her will, a copy of the family trust, and the list of named beneficiaries typed neatly in Black Times New Roman, just as Raina had printed it 2 years ago. At the top, Kyle Marshall, son. Underneath, Brittany Caldwell Marshall, daughter-in-law, both listed as equal beneficiaries, both with full successor rights. Irene stared at the names for a long time, not angrily, not even sadly, just long enough to remember how they got there. She'd added Brittany after the wedding, not because anyone asked her to, but because she wanted Brittany to feel included, to feel like family. She had brought out a new binder, written Brittany's name with careful cursive on the contact sheet, and even asked Raina if she needed to add anything special for a daughter not by blood but by bond. Raina had smiled then, soft and understanding. Only if you want her treated the same. Irene had nodded, without hesitation. Brittany never thanked her, not once, not even with a text. In fact, Brittany had never once initiated a phone call, never brought a pie, never asked about Irene's arthritis or her pension or the garden, but she had asked about the house. 3 times. And Kyle? He'd stopped visiting altogether once that promotion came through. "I'm just swamped, Ma," he had said in a voicemail. "I barely have time to sleep, let alone drop by. You know how it is." Yes, she did. He had time to fly to Arizona for Brittany's cousin's wedding. He had time to join a rec basketball league. He had time to post on Instagram about a new espresso machine, but no time for the woman who had carried him through 36 hours of labor and raised him through 2 recessions. Irene reached for a neon yellow highlighter from the pencil cup. She clicked it once, then slowly, deliberately dragged it across Brittany's name. The thick streak of yellow looked garish on the ivory paper, like someone trying too hard to be important. She set the highlighter down, then picked up her pen, the one with the blue ink, the one Harold had given her when she got promoted to station manager back in '97. She clicked it open, and she began to write. Not a new will. Not yet. But notes, annotations, questions for Raina, possible changes, things she hadn't thought about before, but now saw with perfect clarity. She wrote slowly, letting each letter form completely. After 4 lines, she paused and looked down at the page, and smiled. It wasn't a cruel smile, not even smug. It was the smile of someone remembering she still had options, still had rights, still had time. At the top of the next sheet, she wrote 1 sentence. "If I can't be respected, I won't be inherited." Then she closed the folder and slid it back into the drawer, right beneath the placemats. The kettle had gone quiet by now. She poured the tea, sipped it. It was bitter. She didn't mind. The receptionist at Calder and Brooks barely looked up when Irene walked in, just slid a clipboard forward, smiled, and said, "Ms. Raina will be right with you." Irene signed her name in cursive. Not print, not anymore. The waiting room smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and old upholstery. Law books lined one wall in neat, unread rows. Irene didn't sit. Her knees would lock, and this wasn't the kind of meeting where you entered slow. When Raina finally opened the door to her office, she didn't offer small talk. She just nodded once and gestured toward the leather chair by the desk. "You ready?" Irene didn't hesitate. "Yes, let's update the whole thing." Raina pulled the trust from a locked drawer and began flipping pages. "How deep do you want to cut?" "All the way." A pause. Raina raised an eyebrow. "I mean it," Irene said. "No half measures. I want a no contest clause added too. If they try to fight it, they lose everything." Raina nodded, professional but not cold. "Smart." She typed for a few minutes. Legal language clacked across the screen. Clause numbers, subparagraphs, revocation markers. Irene didn't flinch. She'd filed enough USPS union grievances in her time to understand how language could either protect you or gut you if you weren't looking. When Raina reached the final section, she looked up again. "Do you want to keep them listed at all? As fallback heirs?" Irene shook her head slowly. There's no fallback to disrespect. Raina made a single pen stroke. That was that. On the drive home, Irene didn't put on music. She rolled down the window instead. The chill air rushed in, filled her lungs, and cleaned something out of her chest she didn't have a name for. By the time she pulled into the driveway, the mail had already arrived. She took the bundle from the box, flipping through catalogs and envelopes until a square piece of notepaper fluttered out, lined, folded once, torn from a legal pad. The handwriting was familiar. Kyle's. Sorry about Brit. You good? No salutation, no punctuation, no call. She stared at the note for 5 full seconds, then walked straight inside, didn't take off her shoes, didn't hang up her coat. She went to the living room, opened the drawer of the old filing cabinet, and pulled out the original trust binder, the one with the outdated names and still too hopeful language. She flipped to the page where Brittany's name had been written as co-beneficiary. It was still there, bold and presumptive, as if family loyalty had been implied just by the signature. Irene took one long breath, then calmly, quietly, she leaned forward, lowered her face just inches above the paper, and spit. Not hard, not with anger, just enough to mark it. Then she closed the binder and walked away. No drama, no rage, just punctuation. In the kitchen, she poured herself a glass of cold water and sipped it in silence. The bitterness from the day before had thinned into something else now. Resolve. Back in her bedroom, she opened a fresh notepad and wrote a single line at the top. Names can be written down, but legacies are earned. She underlined earned twice. The pen didn't stutter. That night, she didn't bother checking if Kyle had texted again. She knew he hadn't. He'd already laughed once while someone spit on her. Now she'd returned the favor, just not in the way he'd ever see coming. The porch light was already on by the time their car pulled into the driveway. Kyle's gray SUV, freshly washed, like presentation could outshine intent. Irene had set the table with mismatched mugs and a white linen runner she'd ironed that morning. It wasn't for show. It was for documentation. A mental record of effort not reciprocated. Saturday's sunlight filtered through the kitchen blinds as she poured the coffee. No sugar, just cream. That's how Kyle liked it growing up. She remembered. They didn't knock, just came in. "Hey, Ma," Kyle said, setting his keys in the ceramic bowl by the door. Brittany followed behind him without a word, scrolling her phone with one hand, iced coffee in the other. She wore an oversized hoodie and didn't make eye contact. Her thumb didn't stop moving. "Coffee's fresh," Irene said. "Cinnamon muffins, too. Baked them last night." Kyle sat without removing his coat. "Nice, thanks." Brittany took the muffin, peeled back the paper, sniffed it, and immediately wrapped it in a napkin. She set it on the edge of the plate like it had touched something spoiled. She didn't say, "Thank you." Irene sat across from them. Her hands were folded gently in her lap. Her back was straight. Kyle sipped his coffee, looking around like the walls had gotten smaller since his last visit. "You know," he said after a beat, "this house is probably too much to keep up with these days. All that space, the yard, the stairs." He let the sentence dangle. Brittany looked up briefly. "We could get you into one of those new units over on Walnut, maintenance included. Plus, it'd be easier for us to check in on you." Irene blinked once. "Check in?" Kyle gave a soft chuckle. "We just mean, keep an eye, make sure bills are handled, groceries, that kind of stuff." "I'm aware of what you meant," Irene said. She picked up her coffee, took a slow sip. The silence in the room wasn't awkward. It was curated, like fine glass, transparent but breakable. "Anyway," Kyle said, shifting, "you'd make a killing if you sold this place now. Market's hot. Might as well cash out before winter hits." Irene reached for a muffin and placed it neatly on her own plate. "That's practical advice." Kyle smiled, relieved to be agreed with. "Exactly. You're always smart with this kind of stuff. You'd be set, and Britt and I could help manage the transition." Brittany glanced up. "We could even get the place cleaned out while you're still here, just to make the process smoother." Irene nodded, slowly, like she was taking notes no one else could see. "Let me think about it," she said. "It's a big step." Kyle leaned back, satisfied. No pressure. We're just trying to help. Irene looked down at the untouched muffin wrapped in the napkin on Brittany's plate. No, she said softly. You're trying to inherit in advance. Brittany blinked. Excuse me? But Irene stood. She collected the dishes with calm precision, stacking the plates and mugs without clatter. Thank you for coming, she said. Drive safe. Kyle opened his mouth, then closed it. He recognized the tone, the finality of it. They left 5 minutes later. Back in the kitchen, Irene unfolded the napkin Brittany had discarded. The muffin was still warm. She placed it in a Tupperware, labeled it with the date, and slid it into the freezer. That night, she opened her notebook again, added a fresh line beneath her last entry. You don't get to manage what you never respected. The pen didn't tremble, and neither did she. Michelle Langston walked through the house like she'd done it 1,000 times, heels quiet on the hardwood, tablet in hand, eyes sharp but not unkind. This market's no joke right now, she said, pausing beneath the living room archway. If we list clean and staged, we'll have 3 offers by next weekend. Irene nodded, one hand resting lightly on the back of the armchair Kyle used to fall asleep in as a kid. I'm not looking for a bidding war, just fair and final. Michelle smiled. You're speaking my language. They moved room to room, the hall bath, the sunroom, the back porch with the half-dead geraniums. Irene kept pace, cane tapping lightly, eyes scanning the place not like an owner, but a curator preparing an exhibit's final day. You already have a place in mind? Michelle asked, pausing at the kitchen island. I do. Glenview Estates, corner condo, faces the lake. Michelle's eyebrows lifted. That's a beautiful spot. It's quiet, Irene said, and I won't have to climb stairs to do laundry. They stood in silence for a beat, both women absorbing the weight of transition. Michelle tapped her screen. I'd recommend pre-staging. Box up the family photos, remove anything with names or faces, depersonalize. Irene gave a quiet laugh. That part's already started. She walked Michelle to the door, watched her drive off, then turned back toward the hallway. The house suddenly felt taller, not bigger, not colder, just more vertical, like it was stretching upward to release her. In the next hour, she packed 2 boxes, one with family photos, each frame wrapped in old church bulletins and tucked gently beside the next. The other held her wedding china, never chipped, barely used. She stacked both neatly in the garage and covered them with a soft wool blanket from the linen closet. At 4:17 p.m., her phone buzzed on the counter. Brittany. So what's this we hear about selling? No punctuation, no greeting, no question mark, just expectation. Irene locked the screen without reading it twice. That night she emptied the curio cabinet in the dining room, each ceramic bird placed delicately into newspaper, like she was preparing them for a flight they'd never take. The next morning she listed the piano online. No sentiment, just upright piano, well-maintained, must pick up. By noon, it had a buyer. Kyle hadn't texted, but she knew he knew. She felt it in the air, the tension of people realizing they were no longer being considered. Later, while sorting through the drawer of warranties and appliance manuals, she came across the thick manila folder Kyle had given her 5 years ago. Estate planning checklist for when you're ready. She smiled, then fed every page into the shredder. The final sheet, titled Real Property and Asset Transfers, got a second look before it vanished into ribbons. Downstairs, she opened her notebook and wrote a new line. Inheritance isn't payment for endurance, especially when you're the one being endured. The pen didn't hesitate. That evening, she stepped out onto the porch with a cup of tea. The sky had softened into a flat orange band over the rooftops, and the neighborhood kids were riding bikes in slow circles, voices trailing like music on low volume. Inside the house behind her, boxes were beginning to line the hallway. It didn't feel like leaving, it felt like reclaiming, and when the sale went through, because it would, Kyle and Brittany wouldn't just be excluded from the paper, they'd be erased from the assumption that it had ever belonged to them in the first place. The lockbox wasn't new. Irene had bought it 12 years ago at a yard sale for $5, thinking she'd use it for recipes. She never did. The key had stayed taped to the underside ever since. She peeled the tape off now, turned the tiny brass notch, and opened the lid like she was unsealing her own resolve. Inside, she began arranging the pages with quiet precision. Final trust documents, notarized, signed, bound in a slim folder with tabs. Her sister Donna was now listed as emergency contact, healthcare proxy, and successor trustee. Malia, her goddaughter, raised polite and steady, would receive the car, the CDs, and the remainder of the accounts. Irene had even added a small note in the margin. For student loan payoff or a down payment, your call. She didn't cry. She labeled envelopes instead. Account logins, safe deposit box information, utility providers, her funeral wishes, cremation, no viewing, hymn list included. Amazing grace and abide with me. No lilies, no pity. The last item she placed on top was a one-page letter with her signature at the bottom. This box contains my final instructions and beneficiaries. It is not to be altered. It is not up for debate. She closed the lid, turned the key, and wrote one word on the front in red permanent marker. Final. Not dramatic, not poetic, just definitive. At 3:04 p.m., her phone buzzed for the 5th time in 20 minutes. Brittany, mobile. Incoming call. Irene stared at the screen, watched it ring out. A minute later, it rang again. She swiped to block. The number vanished from her list, but not from her memory. Brittany had earned that slot with every smug silence and every eye roll she thought went unnoticed. The silence that followed was brief. At 3:18 p.m., her voicemail pinged. Kyle. His voice, once boyish, now strained with the panic of someone slowly realizing the ladder they thought they were climbing had been pulled away. Hey, Ma, we just want to talk. No drama, just, can we talk? Irene listened twice, then deleted it. She sat on the couch with her hands resting on her lap. The house was quiet except for the soft whirl of the ceiling fan and the distant thump of someone's bass-heavy car passing by outside. The red box sat on the coffee table, the word final gleaming in the late light like a warning label and a benediction at the same time. Irene picked up her notebook again. She turned past the last few entries, past the line about inheritance and endurance, and found a clean page. She wrote, "You don't lose family when they walk away from your door. You lose them when they laugh while someone spits on your hand." She dotted the period hard. That night, she slid the red box beneath her bed. Not hidden, not buried, just placed where it belonged. Not because she was preparing to go, because she'd decided exactly who would carry on after she was gone. And none of them lived in that gray SUV. The morning sun sat low behind the backyard fence, casting long slats of light across the lawn as Irene tied on her gardening gloves. They were worn at the fingertips, faded to a soft gray in places where the original green had given up. She didn't need to wear them. She wasn't pruning or digging today, but the ritual of putting them on still mattered. Some habits were less about function and more about memory. Her knees bent slower than they used to, and the ground seemed a little farther away than it had been the year before, but she lowered herself onto the overturned bucket with quiet determination. The garden stretched out before her in its late autumn stubbornness, thinned tomato vines curling on empty trellises, basil gone to seed, rosemary still proud and sharp. But it was the roses that held her. 3 bushes, all yellow. Kyle had helped her plant them the summer he turned 9, his small hands gripping the spade like it was a toy. He'd knelt beside her in the dirt, careful, curious, always asking what each root did, how the petals knew when to bloom. He'd named each one Sunny, Butter, and Goldie. The names had faded from his memory long ago. Irene, however, remembered every syllable. She reached forward and gently turned one of the blossoms in her gloved hand. It had opened wide in the past few days, flaunting itself one final time before the first frost. There was a quiet defiance to that bloom, and Irene found herself grateful for it. Her phone buzzed once in her pocket. She didn't check it. Instead, she took out the small garden shears she'd brought and snipped a single rose at its base. She held it in both hands like something sacred and walked slowly back inside, leaving her gloves on the bench as she passed. In the kitchen, she placed the rose between 2 sheets of wax paper and carefully pressed it between the pages of her old church hymnal, the same one that still bore faint traces of Harold's scribbled bass notes in the margins. She closed the book gently and set it beneath the heavy Dutch oven on the counter. Then she turned toward the hallway and opened the closet where the photo boxes were stored. Inside, she found a manila envelope labeled House Photos, 2009, and removed 5 blank note cards from the back. She walked through the house slowly, snapping new pictures with her phone. One of the kitchen window with the lace curtain she'd hemmed herself, another of the sunlight hitting the piano bench, one of the garden through the screen door, the couch that still had Harold's imprint, and finally, the 3 rose bushes catching the last full light of the day. She posted the listing on Facebook an hour later. No caption asking for inquiries, no eager hashtags, just one sentence. Sometimes you grow something just to let it go. She didn't look to see who liked it. She didn't refresh for comments. She simply closed the app, set the phone down, and opened the drawer where her notebooks were. She flipped to the latest entry, added the date, and wrote, "This isn't abandonment. It's an offering. One more bloom before winter." She set the pen down slowly and looked out the window again. In the corner of the yard, a bird had landed near the middle rose bush, hopping between 2 fallen petals without disturbing either one. Irene stood there for a long moment, letting the stillness absorb her. The house didn't feel like a place she was fleeing anymore. It felt like a story she was finally choosing to end on her own terms. And outside, beneath the heavy quiet of the dusk, the roses held their silence too. The pen moved steadily across the final page, its tip gliding in smooth ink where her name had already lived in print. Irene paused after the last stroke, letting the blue settle before placing the pen beside the folder. Her hands didn't shake. Not from age, not from nerves. They simply rested. Michelle gave a single nod, a practiced, respectful motion from years of closing doors on old chapters. "That's it," she said, lifting the folder with both hands. "We're officially scheduled. Final walkthrough Thursday, closing Friday morning." Irene nodded back. "Thank you, Michelle." "No rush on the packing," Michelle added. "Just let me know if you want a mover recommendation." "I already called 2, Irene replied, "and I've got one I trust." Michelle smiled and squeezed Irene's shoulder lightly, then left through the side gate, heels clicking once against the stone path before silence took over again. The house exhaled around her. Empty corners and light through the blinds made the place feel like it had taken a step back from her, giving her space to finish her goodbye. By the time late afternoon settled in, Irene had brewed a cup of chamomile and carried it to the front room. The dining table was bare now, except for the red lockbox sitting squarely in the center, a quiet sentinel over everything that was finally in order. She was halfway through her tea when the knock came. Not urgent, not polite, just entitled. She set the mug down slowly and walked toward the door, cane tapping softly against the tile. Through the sheer curtain, she recognized the shape of him, broad shoulders in a puffer jacket, hands in pockets, jaw tight in a way he hadn't learned from her. Kyle. Irene didn't open the door fully. She opened the inner wooden door, leaving the storm screen shut between them. A deliberate barrier. The latch clicked softly. "Ma," he said, "I saw the listing. What the hell is going on?" His voice wasn't angry exactly, just layered with confusion that expected an answer. "You should have called," Irene said evenly. "I tried," he replied. "You blocked Brittany. I didn't know if you blocked me too. You didn't try hard enough." He sighed, shifted his weight. "This is insane. You're overreacting." Irene tilted her head slightly. "Overreacting?" Kyle lifted his hands, voice rising just slightly. "You're selling the house, cutting us off, won't take our calls? What else am I supposed to think?" She didn't raise her voice in return. "You're supposed to think about the fact that I asked for a family, and instead I got silence and spit." Kyle blinked. "It was a joke." "It was disrespect," she said, "and so was your laugh." His mouth opened like he might fight it, might defend. But the words didn't come. "I made my decisions," Irene continued. "They're filed, signed, and soon to be closed." "Is this about punishment?" he asked. "Because if it is, it's about peace," she said. "Mine. For once." He stepped back slightly, glancing toward the yard like it might change the subject for him. "You really won't even let me in?" Irene looked at the latch between them, then back at his face. "No," she said. Kyle nodded once, like he'd just understood a rule that had always been in place but never enforced. "Okay," he said quietly. "I guess that's that." She didn't answer. He turned and walked back to the SUV. The engine roared once before quieting as he reversed slowly out of the drive. Back inside, Irene sat again. The tea had gone cool. She didn't reheat it. Instead, she took the framed picture off the mantel, one of Kyle at 16, smiling in his marching band uniform, and set it face down in the donation box. She picked up her pen and wrote a single line in her notebook. He finally knocked. But by then, the lock wasn't what kept him out. And she meant it. It was just after 7 on a Tuesday when the knocking began. Not a knock, really. Not something measured or respectful. It was pounding. Fast and loud, fists meeting wood with the rhythm of outrage rather than urgency. Irene had been finishing her evening routine. The dishwasher had just clicked off. Her robe was tied. The red box was back under the bed, untouched since Friday's closing. When the first thud hit the door, she didn't flinch. She simply turned down the lamp and walked to the front entry with the patience of someone who already knew what was waiting. Through the peephole, 2 blurred forms stood side by side. Brittany's hair was pulled into a messy bun, her jaw tight, eyes wide with the kind of entitlement that feeds itself. Kyle stood beside her, more wilted than angry this time. Hands in pockets, shoulders slightly hunched, a man dragged by someone else's thunder. Irene didn't open the storm door. She cracked the wooden one just an inch. Her voice was calm. "It's late." Brittany pushed forward, hands spread, already mid-sentence. "You don't get to ignore us, then list the house, and then send that notice without a conversation. That's not how families work." Irene said nothing. "You're manipulating the whole situation. Emotional blackmail," Brittany went on, her voice climbing. "We didn't even get a chance to fix anything. You're just throwing years away because your feelings got hurt." Irene blinked slowly, then stepped back without a word. She returned a moment later with her phone. She tapped once. The audio played. Through the speaker clearly, Brittany's voice, unmistakable, clipped and cold. "I don't care what she says. She acts like a housemaid with opinions. You can't reason with old people who still think casseroles count as affection. She's exhausting." Silence followed. Not just from the phone, but from the porch. Brittany's lips parted slightly. Her spine stiffened, and then, slowly, she looked over at Kyle, whose expression had changed from passive to embarrassed. "You kept that?" Brittany asked, voice quieter now. "I document things," Irene replied. Her voice had weight, but not malice, just certainty. "You knew I'd hear that eventually," Irene continued, holding Brittany's gaze. "You just didn't think I'd still be standing when I did." "I was venting," Brittany muttered, but even she didn't sound convinced. "You were spitting. First on my hand, then on my life." Brittany's hands curled into fists at her sides. "I didn't think you were going to be this dramatic. You're rewriting history like we were monsters." "No," Irene said, stepping forward slightly. "I'm rewriting the future to make sure monsters don't profit." Kyle tried to interject, reaching forward with one hand. "Can we all just—" But Irene turned to him directly. "She called me a housemaid. You laughed when she spit on me. And now you're here asking for civility. You forfeited your place the moment you decided silence was easier than respect." Brittany's eyes narrowed. "You think this makes you look strong? It just makes you look bitter." Irene didn't blink. "Spit washes off," she said softly. "Entitlement sticks." The screen door remained shut between them. Not locked out of fear, but placed with intent. "You need help," Brittany snapped, stepping back. "Like real help." "No," Irene said. "I needed help. And you didn't show up. Now, I'm fine." Kyle opened his mouth again, but Irene had already closed the wooden door. Behind her, the house was still. The clock ticked once from the mantel. The heater hummed gently to life. She didn't pace. She didn't cry. She walked back to the kitchen and poured herself a half glass of water, sipped it slowly, and returned the phone to its charger. Outside, muffled voices argued on the porch. A car door slammed, then silence. And when Irene picked up her pen that night, she wrote only one line. They didn't knock to apologize. They knocked to salvage what they thought still belonged to them, and for the first time in a long time, she slept without dreams. The notary's pen clicked once, twice, then moved across the page with smooth finality. The seal followed, circular, precise, and embossed with a quiet authority that didn't need to raise its voice to speak volumes. Irene sat across the table from Raina in the small corner office of Calder and Brooks, the same office where this had all begun just weeks ago. The light from the window slanted across the grain of the desk, catching the edge of the legal folder now labeled Executed. "I don't think they know what you've done yet," Raina said as she flipped the final page and slid the trust summary into its tab. "I don't need them to know," Irene replied. "That's the difference between control and closure." She wore her Sunday navy blouse, not because it was a special day, but because it felt like armor. Clean lines, buttoned to the collar, dignity dressed, not displayed. "All assets rerouted, just as we outlined," Raina said, ticking items off the checklist with her fingertip. "House proceeds, already pending transfer to the Glenview account. Life insurance, designated to your goddaughter Malia and your sister Donna, equal shares. Pension, survivorship benefits removed, redirected." "And the clause?" Irene asked. Raina smiled faintly, tapping one page with a single fingernail. "Enforced and airtight. If they challenge it in court, they forfeit any claim to the remainder. We've attached documentation of behavior, neglect patterns, and that audio file you provided. This isn't just emotionally justified, it's legally sound." Irene nodded slowly, her eyes calm but not cold. "Good. I don't need revenge. I need insurance." Raina reached into the bottom drawer and slid across a fresh manila envelope. "I had my assistant compile everything. Originals for you. Copies filed with the clerk and backed up digitally. Not even a fire could undo it now." Irene took the envelope with both hands and placed it in her canvas tote beside a notebook, a zippered pouch of her reading glasses, and a folded printout of her moving checklist. As she zipped the tote closed, her fingers hesitated. "There's one more thing," she said. "A statement. For the record." Raina raised an eyebrow. "A letter?" "A declaration," Irene clarified. "In case they ever try to twist the story, I want it to be in my words." She pulled out a single page and handed it across the table. Raina read in silence, "To whom it may concern, I, Irene Marshall, of sound mind and independent function, made the following legal decisions. Not out of spite, but out of necessity. I was subjected to emotional humiliation, social neglect, and material manipulation by those originally listed as beneficiaries. This document is not a reaction, it is a restoration. The right to choose who honors you is not bitterness. It's the last dignity left to many women like me, and I claim it fully under law and conscience." When she finished, Raina folded the page and placed it in the central file. "Would you like that notarized as well?" Irene nodded once. "Please." As the seal pressed down once more, a light wind stirred the ivy outside the office window. The leaves scratched faintly against the pane, like fingers brushing glass. By the time Irene stepped outside, the sun had shifted westward. The tote weighed more now, not physically, but symbolically. It carried not just documents, but definition. Her phone buzzed in her coat pocket as she crossed the parking lot. Kyle. Again. She didn't answer. She didn't delete it either. Let the call sit in voicemail, like a stone skipping the surface without sinking deep. Back at home, she placed the envelope into the red lockbox, tucked beneath the final page she'd written weeks ago. Then she pulled out her notebook. Today's entry was shorter than most. "What they wanted was inheritance. What I kept was peace. Let the paperwork argue on my behalf." She closed the notebook gently and slid it into the drawer. Outside, the wind picked up just enough to rustle the leaves on the porch, and Irene smiled, not because she'd won, because she no longer needed to explain why she didn't lose. The funds hit her account at 9:03 a.m. sharp. Irene stood at the small kitchen counter of her condo, phone in hand, glasses perched low on her nose, watching the balance refresh with a calm that felt like ceremony. No excitement, no disbelief, just quiet confirmation that the final transaction of her old life had cleared without a ripple. The house was sold. She didn't text anyone. She didn't forward the deposit screen. She simply locked her phone, set it face down beside her tea, and returned to unpacking the last box. Her new place smelled faintly of fresh paint and the vanilla diffuser Donna had gifted her on move-in day. The walls were a soft cream, the floors warm oak laminate, and every appliance blinked with newness. Even the dishwasher had a plastic film she hadn't yet peeled away. She'd placed the red lockbox on the top shelf of the closet in her bedroom, not hidden, but high enough to remind herself she'd already done the hard part. Outside the wide sliding doors, Lake Sterling gleamed under morning light. Ducks floated in uneven rows, and somewhere a child laughed from a neighboring balcony. Irene had chosen this unit for the eastern view and the quiet, both of which now felt like earned luxuries, not lucky ones. Her email chimed twice. She debated checking it. Then she did. The first message was from Brittany. Subject, "You're cruel." No greeting, no sign-off, just a block of gray preview text too bitter to skim without consequence. Irene hovered over it for a moment, then hit delete. No folder, no screenshot, no reply. The second message was from Kyle. Subject, "We messed up." She clicked it open. She didn't know why. "Ma, I'm not going to make excuses. We handled it badly. All of it. I didn't see it clearly then, and maybe that's part of the problem. I should have said something. About the way Britt talked to you. About that day. I know we can't undo it, but I hope you don't think I ever stopped loving you. I was stupid. If you ever want to talk, I'm here. Kyle." She read it twice, then clicked "Mark as read" and closed her laptop. There was no satisfaction in his regret. Not because it wasn't real, but because it was too late to matter. That afternoon, she rearranged the books on her new shelves, fiction to the left, photo albums to the right, cookbooks in the middle. She added a new one to the end of the row, Estates and Rights, a modern primer, a gift from Raina, tucked into the closing folder like a secret handshake. The sun dipped low behind the lake as she made herself a small dinner, roasted vegetables, a chicken thigh, a single piece of cornbread from a recipe Donna still swore wasn't the real Southern kind. She ate slowly, then washed each dish by hand. Not out of habit, out of clarity. By the time night settled, Irene stepped out onto her balcony with a blanket wrapped loosely around her shoulders. The wind off the water was cool, but not biting. In the distance, a few porch lights flickered on. Her neighbor's laughter echoed faintly, familiar but not intrusive. Her phone buzzed once more. Another text from Kyle. She let it sit on the screen. Didn't open it. Didn't delete it either. She turned instead to her notebook, flipped to a new page and wrote, "Final wire received. Final wound not reopened." She paused, then underlined it. A soft knock came at the door. Not loud, not urgent. She opened it cautiously. It was the property manager, a young woman with thick braids and kind eyes, holding a small welcome basket wrapped in cellophane. "Just wanted to say we're glad you're here, Ms. Marshall." Irene accepted the basket with both hands. Inside were local brochures, a voucher for the neighborhood cafe, and a tiny potted lavender plant. Her fingers brushed the rim of the pot. The soil was fresh. "Thank you," she said, and meant it. As the door closed behind her, she placed the lavender on the windowsill. Outside, the lake held its reflection. Inside, she no longer needed to explain who had been cut out or why. The closing wasn't just a legal step. It was a punctuation mark, and Irene, at last, was fluent in her own ending. The new home had settled into itself. Cardboard boxes had vanished into recycling. The smell of fresh paint had mellowed into something warmer, softer, like linen sheets left out in the sun. Irene moved through the space with a quiet rhythm. Not unpacking anymore, just inhabiting. Every drawer now knew its purpose. Every dish had its place. Even the hum of the fridge no longer startled her in the middle of the night. That evening, she boiled water for tea the way she always had. Kettle on, mug ready. A single chamomile bag pulled from the tin Donna had filled for her, labeled in tidy cursive, "Sleep blend, steep long, trust longer." She stood by the counter as the water rolled into a full simmer, then poured it gently, watching the curls of steam rise like unwritten words. The mug warmed her hands immediately. She didn't rush it to her lips. Instead, she turned off the overhead light and walked toward the sliding glass door. Outside, the lake was quiet. No wind, no boats, just the wide shimmer of water holding moonlight like a breath it refused to let go. She sat. No television, no music, just her and the tea and the hush of a place that didn't ask anything of her. Her phone buzzed once from the charger on the kitchen counter. She didn't check it, not tonight. Instead, she reached for the leather-bound journal that rested on the end table beside her recliner. It was brand new, gifted by Malia the week she moved in. Still crisp at the edges, still smelling faintly of glue and clean pages. She opened to the first page, paused, then wrote, "I stopped being sorry." The pen glided smoothly, as if the words had been waiting beneath her skin all this time, just looking for a page brave enough to carry them. She sat with that sentence for several minutes, not moving on, not decorating it, letting it stand, not sorry for protecting her name, not sorry for defending her boundaries, not sorry for locking the door and not opening it when knocking no longer meant kindness. She took a sip of tea. The flavor was soft but decisive, steeped long enough to speak. She wrote again. They needed me to be the villain because that's the only way their comfort made sense. Her hand didn't tremble. Her jaw didn't clench. She wrote for another 10 minutes, line after line, memories reframed not in vengeance, but in precision. A record, a reclamation, a refusal to let silence reshape truth. Out the window, a few scattered lights shimmered on the far side of the lake. The shape of a bird coasted low across the surface, its wings catching just enough glow to leave a trace. Irene closed the journal gently and placed it on the table. She looked out again. It wasn't regret she felt, and it wasn't triumph either. It was recognition. This woman, alone, unbothered, drinking tea by moonlight, was not someone to pity or scold. She was someone who had rewritten the story while the ink was still hers to hold. She stood, stretched, and dimmed the room. Back in her bedroom, the red lockbox remained undisturbed, a guardian of decisions no longer up for negotiation. As she pulled back the covers, she paused only once to look around. The walls did not echo. The air didn't feel heavy. The quiet here was not emptiness. It was relief. And just before she clicked off the bedside lamp, she whispered, not in anger, not in sorrow, just in clarity, "They'll tell it wrong someday." Then, smiling faintly, "But they won't own the ending." The room went still, and sleep came easy. The knock came mid-morning, light, quick, and familiar. Irene opened the door to find Mrs. Yvette Larkin, her upstairs neighbor, holding 2 envelopes and a folded printout. "Mail got mixed up again," Yvette said, passing the letters over with one hand and fanning herself with the other. "And I didn't mean to look, but—" She trailed off, her eyes flicking toward the printout as if it had asked to be noticed. "What is it?" Irene asked, setting the envelopes on the counter. Yvette unfolded the page with a half-apologetic shrug. "Someone sent this to me in a group message. Thought you might want to know." It was a screenshot of a Facebook post, Brittany's profile photo prominent in the corner. The post had been up for 5 hours. "R.I.P. to the woman who raised him. May karma teach her what love never could." No names. But it didn't need one. The comments had already stacked into 24 vague sympathies and a few pointed barbs. Someone had replied, "Wait, who passed?" To which Brittany had simply answered with a broken heart emoji. Irene read it once, then laughed. Quietly. Without bitterness. It wasn't the kind of laugh that bubbled up. It was the kind that released something. She handed the paper back to Yvette. "Well," she said, I suppose it's easier to grieve a person you've erased than face one who's still living. Yvette raised an eyebrow. You want me to say something? Irene shook her head. No need. Let them talk to ghosts. That weekend, she hosted brunch. Not a grand affair, just a small table, 2 friends from her old USPS station, and a peach tart Donna had dropped off with a note. For company you actually like. The coffee was strong, the laughter louder. A small vase of lavender sat in the center of the table, and the scent floated easily through the condo like it belonged there. Louise, who had retired the same year Irene had, leaned over her plate with a look only decades of friendship could pull off. So, what really happened? Irene poured more coffee before answering. Let's just say they thought love was something that guaranteed them a deed. The women laughed, but there was a pause after, a shared understanding that what Irene had lived through wasn't just petty or dramatic or unfortunate, it was familiar. Too familiar. I left them with everything they gave me, Irene said finally, which is to say, nothing. A long silence followed. Then Clara, who hadn't said much all morning, looked up from her plate. I think you saved yourself. Irene tilted her head. Maybe. No, maybe about it, Clara said. You didn't get bitter. You got strategic. The room held that thought for a while. Later, after the dishes were cleared and the tart reduced to crumbs, Irene brought out the journal. She didn't read from it, not yet, but she laid it on the table and rested her hand on the cover. They'll say I was cold, she said. They'll say I shut them out. Louise leaned in. And we'll say you were finally heard. Irene nodded once. Outside, the sun had begun its slow descent toward the lake, casting golden strips of light across the carpet. The condo wasn't just a new address now, it was the clean page she'd fought to write on. As her friends gathered their coats and hugged her goodbye, Irene walked them to the door, waving as they headed down the walkway. One of them turned back and said, Next time our place. We'll see, Irene said, smiling. She closed the door, leaned her back against it, and looked around the quiet room. There were no shadows here, no ghosts, just the sound of her own breathing, and the knowledge that somewhere out there someone had declared her gone, only to realize too late, you can't bury someone who's already buried you back. She walked to the window, watching the light flicker off the lake. And then, almost to herself, she said, I'm still here. And the silence that followed agreed. The folding chairs in the church annex weren't comfortable, but Irene didn't mind. They creaked the same way they always had, like old wood adjusting to new company. She sat near the middle, not in the front. She wasn't here to perform, but not in the back either. Some visibility was earned. The church book club met twice a month. Nothing flashy, no potlucks, just coffee in styrofoam cups, pastel-covered devotionals, and the soft clink of reading glasses against glass cases as women fished them out before scripture. It had taken Irene 3 weeks after moving in to show up, not because she'd been hesitant, because she'd been precise. She hadn't joined for fellowship or to fill the time. She joined to begin something new that didn't feel like a replacement. The topic that day was Ruth. Women who chose loyalty not out of obligation, but out of decision. Irene read the assigned passage slowly, letting her voice move with calm rhythm. When she finished, no one clapped. They just nodded, quietly, like something had been sewn without thread. After the meeting, a young woman lingered near the back. She was maybe 30, maybe less, hair pulled back, ring on her finger that seemed too heavy for the way her shoulders sloped. She approached with hesitation, like she wasn't used to taking up space. Ms. Marshall? She asked softly. Can I ask you something? Irene closed her book and folded her hands gently. Of course. I heard what you said today, about boundaries not being bitterness. I did say that, Irene said with a small smile. The young woman hesitated. My in-laws, they've been living with us since February. They say it's temporary, but they treat me like I'm the guest, like I'm borrowing space from their son. Irene didn't ask for details. She didn't need them. Do you have a place to sit and think? She asked instead. The woman blinked. What? A chair, a corner, a quiet spot that's only yours. Start there, reclaim something small, and don't apologize for it. The young woman nodded slowly, eyes glassy. They didn't exchange phone numbers, they didn't hug, but the connection was made, something passed not through instruction, but recognition. Later that evening, Irene sat on her balcony again. The lavender from the welcome basket had begun to bloom. She watered it with the precision of someone who knew small things deserved care even when no one was watching. Her phone rang. Not a buzz, not a text. A call. Malia. She answered on the second ring. "Auntie," Malia said, her voice already thick with feeling. "I don't even know where to start. I finally told Derek I'm not co-signing for his mama's car. I told him no, and you know what? He didn't like it, but he didn't leave. He's learning. And I'm learning I don't have to bleed every time someone else calls it love." Irene didn't interrupt. She let it all come out. The tremble, the triumph, the grateful release. "I think you really changed my life," Malia said finally, voice quieter now. "You didn't yell. You didn't lecture. You just showed me what it looked like to not flinch anymore." Irene felt something settle in her chest, warm and earned. "Then keep going," she said. "Walk like it's already yours." After they hung up, she opened her notebook again. This time, she didn't write anything about loss. She didn't write anything about them. She wrote, "Every time you choose yourself without apology, someone else realizes they can too." She underlined it once. Outside, the church bells rang softly, just 3 notes, but they carried. And for the first time in a long time, Irene didn't feel like someone recovering. She felt like someone rising. The new nameplate arrived on a Thursday. Wrapped in brown paper and tucked inside a small velvet pouch, it was heavier than Irene expected. Cool, clean brass with serif lettering and a brushed finish that caught the light without calling attention to itself. "I'm Marshall." Unbothered. She ran her thumb across the engraved words once, then again, slower. There was no flair to it, no extra flourish. Just a statement fixed in metal. She was not to be disturbed by pity, by legacy, or by people who only knocked when something was at stake. She stood at the front door of her condo with a small screwdriver in hand. The morning sun had warmed the frame just enough to soften the metal as she affixed the plaque, screw by screw. She didn't rush the task. She took her time, like someone anchoring their own story in the right place. By 10:30, she was setting the tea tray. The lavender had bloomed again, small purple tufts now trimmed into a centerpiece beside the scones. Irene's folding table was dressed in a pale yellow cloth and set for 4. China teacups, cloth napkins, cucumber sandwiches, and just enough peach preserves to sweeten the tongue without overpowering the biscuit. She had even placed a small bowl of lemon wedges beside the honey jar. It wasn't about impressing, it was about completeness. Donna arrived first, purse in hand, cardigan draped over one shoulder. "It smells like freedom out here," she said as she sat down, nodding at the flower beds. "And lemon balm." Malia followed, holding a mason jar of cut stems and wearing a sundress that fluttered at the hem. "Thought your table needed company," she said. 2 neighbors joined just after noon, Mrs. Larkin from upstairs and a retired librarian named Ruth. Conversation unfolded slowly, comfortably. No one interrupted, no one dominated. They talked about novels, knee joints, music, and the quiet joy of canceling plans without guilt. No one mentioned Kyle, no one asked about Brittany, and Irene didn't offer. Because today was not a day for rehashing, it was a day for reaffirming. After the guests had left and the dishes were drying in the sink, Irene walked to the hall closet and retrieved the old estate binder. It was thicker than it needed to be. Tabs, receipts, plans made when the wrong people still had her trust. She flipped it open one last time, glanced at the tabs labeled Kyle and Real Property Transfer, then pulled the binder's contents out in one smooth motion. She walked it straight to the shred pile beside the recycling bin. The paper hissed as it disappeared through the blades. Soft, final, unceremonious. Later, she returned to the balcony with her notebook. The late afternoon sky had turned copper and quiet, the lake catching the color like a polished mirror. Her pen rested in her fingers without pressure, as if even it knew there wasn't much left to say. But she wrote anyway. She wrote one final line. Spit dries. Paper burns. Dignity lives wherever you choose to reclaim it. Then she closed the journal. Inside, the condo's silence was no longer emptiness. It was structure, integrity. A life finally lived on Irene's terms, not in resistance to anyone else, but in reverence to herself. The nameplate on the door caught the last flick of sunlight, and he awed it there. And Irene, surrounded by lavender, fresh tea, and her own unbothered breath, knew this wasn't a recovery story. It was a declaration, sealed in metal, and this time, no one could edit it.